As war raged in Europe, France and England once again turned their attention toward their North American territories. As before, the Wabanaki Confederacy and the Iroquois Confederacy allied themselves with the French and British, hoping to effect some great change for their rapidly shrinking continent. Fighting focused once again over control of Acadia and the St. Lawrence River. In 1745, the British colonists achieved the first substantial gain in the last 50 years of colonial warfare with the capture of Fortress Louisburg at the mouth of the St. Lawrence River. Fighting stretched down into the colony of New York as well as New England. The war took an awful toll on the British colonists, particularly in the final years of fighting. When the war at last came to an end in 1748, the British colonists were forced to return Louisburg to the French, infuriating the colonists who had won it at an excessive cost of life. Once again, after years of violence, the borders were returned to their pre-war status, with nothing having been gained. Territorial disputes went unsettled, grudges continued, and the situation in the North American backcountry was still violent as English colonists, French colonists, and Native American tribes all vied for control of the wilderness. The undefined borders between British and French colonies had long been an issue between the two nations. Yet, despite multiple conflicts, no formal agreement had been reached as far as definitively laying out who owned what. It was only a matter of time before war broke out again. In late 1753, the lieutenant governor of the Virginia colony, Robert Dinwiddie, ordered a young Virginia major named George Washington to remove French colonial troops from forts in the Ohio River Valley. The colony of Virginia claimed this territory as its own and felt that it was within their right to vacate the French from the forts, which still dotted the region from the last century of fighting. The expedition resulted in a French rejection of Virginia's demands, and Washington, who was promoted to lieutenant colonel upon his return, was once again sent into the Ohio River Valley to remove the French from their forts, by force if necessary. In April 1754, French troops learned from their native allies, the Mingos, that a small British fort had been built by colonial militia at the forks of the Ohio River. French troops marched to the fort and captured it. They built in its place a much later fortification which they named Fort Duquesne. Meanwhile, further south in the valley, Colonel Washington and his small force of colonial militia and natives, allied to the English, came upon and engaged an encampment of unsuspecting French troops. The French were quickly overwhelmed, and later explained that they had been sent to intercept Washington peacefully and to warn him of his apparent incursion in what they believed was French territory. To Washington's surprise, the leader of the native forces accompanying him, Tenarison, attacked and killed the wounded French commander, likely due to a long-standing hatred of the French. Washington feared the French would attack and constructed a small fort, which he named Fort Necessity. Necessity was, as Washington predicted, quickly surrounded by French troops from Duquesne and forced to surrender. This small skirmish set the world on fire. Lieutenant Governor Dinwiddie called for aid from his fellow colonies and from the British government back in England. Fearing that the incursion would strengthen French claims to the region, the British government immediately sent troops to strike at the various French forts still in and around the St. Lawrence River and the Ohio River Valley. The French sent additional forces to North America to hold off the inevitable British invasion. Quite suddenly, France and England were once again at war. Multiple early British forays into the Ohio River Valley and Canada failed spectacularly. Early into the war, it seemed as though the French would be able to secure their holdings in North America, and even found success in capturing a number of critical British forts in the colony of New York, including Fort Ticonderoga and Fort William Henry. In 1758, fortunes changed for the English, as the complicated system of entangled alliances produced by the past century of war finally ignited the 7 Years' War. The fighting in the Ohio River Valley, known as the French and Indian War in America, had launched the largest European land war to date, with every major European power of the era engaged. Millions of soldiers and thousands of naval vessels were activated for duty. Fighting stretched not only across North American, but to Europe, the Caribbean, India, and Asia. As the French were forced to direct their attention to Europe and to other more valuable parts of their empire, the British were able to take advantage on the North American front, with the British Navy actively keeping the French from not being able to resupply along the St. Lawrence River. British and American colonial forces successfully captured Fort Niagara, Fortress Louisbourg, and the city of Quebec. As the French lost more and more ground, it became clear that the fight for North America was over. In 1760, British General Geoffrey Amherst managed to secure a formal surrender from the governor of New France, Pierre-François de Ragueau, Marquis de Vaudreuil-Cavagnol, and largely ended the hostilities in North America. Meanwhile, the 7 Years' War continued abroad and continued to carve pieces from the Kingdom of France and her allies. In 1763, the 7 Years' War officially came to an end, and the French and Indian War with it. Casualties were astronomical for the period, with some estimates reaching as high as 1.4 million. Of that number, the French and Indian War accounted for roughly 23,000 killed, wounded, or captured, just under 2% of the total casualties of the global conflict. For nearly a century, England had beaten back the French, Dutch, and Spanish empires, gradually cementing its claim to the New World. Over the course of the 18th century, the successes of the British Empire during these conflicts had created the ideal conditions for their colonies in North America to experience an incredible population boom. From roughly 250,000 in 1700 to more than 1.25 million in 1750. The raw materials produced by the American colonies, including hemp, copper, and tar, were necessary for the British Army and Navy to wage war and protect the vastly growing empire. While it was in the interest of the British Empire to defeat the French and secure their North American holdings, it had also been in the colonists' interests. The English colonists had no great love for the French, and anti-Catholic sentiment was a regular part of colonial life, especially in places like New England, which had been staunchly Protestant for the first 2 centuries of its settlement. That the American colonies were made up chiefly of individuals of the Protestant faith was, naturally, no coincidence. Many Protestant organizations had funded the various colonization efforts through the 17th century, and had maintained a lasting impact and presence into the 1700s. However, the strongest impact of Protestantism in the American colonies came during the colonial wars, which dominated the early and mid-18th century. A global religious phenomenon occurred, known as the Great Awakening, gripped both Europe and North America, and brought the Protestant faith to new heights. The Great Awakening was a major evangelical revival which expanded the Protestant faith throughout Europe and colonial North America. The revival brought about new religious theories and dogma, as concepts such as the nature of salvation and the idea of rebirth were spread by itinerant preachers who traveled the countryside giving sermons and lectures as they saw fit. These preachers were tremendous orators and captured captive audiences wherever they went. George Whitefield, a major player in this evangelical movement, traveled across the colonies and preached in major cities and small towns, wherever he could gather a crowd. And gather them he did. In October 1740, while preaching in Boston, Massachusetts, Whitefield allegedly drew a crowd of more than 30,000 people from around New England. To put that in perspective, Boston was the highest populated city in colonial North America in 1740, coming in at roughly 17,000 people living in and around the city. Nearly double the city's population was present to hear Whitefield speak. The movement revived the religious spirit of Christian peoples and reaffirmed their faith through periods of intense conflict and uncertain survival. While the revival did not change governments or raise great armies as religious revivals had done in the past in Europe, the Great Awakening was formative for many individuals in colonial North America, many of whom would go on to be the founding fathers and mothers of the nation. The 1763 Treaty of Paris saw enormous territorial gains for Great Britain. Vast swaths of formerly French-occupied land were now British colonies, including Canada, all of the Louisiana Territory east of the Mississippi, and many Caribbean islands. The British colonists in North America were ecstatic, as the land to the west would soon be open for settlement and development. The land, however, was already occupied, namely by the many Iroquois and other native tribes who had fought alongside the British during the war. To avoid any incidents, King George III issued the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which forbade any settlement west of a line drawn along the Appalachian Mountains, known as the Proclamation Line. Effectively, the British had created an Indian reserve to the west of the Appalachians and east of the Mississippi. This did not sit well with American colonists, who felt that they had fought the French and Indian War to gain access to this land. Naturally, many ignored the proclamation and settled west, increasing tension between themselves and the natives, much to the dismay of British colonial authorities. Relations between the British government and the American colonists became increasingly strained through the 1760s, as Great Britain attempted to regain control of their economy. The 7 Years' War had grown from a territorial dispute into a full-fledged global conflict, with a cost to go with it. To pay off the war debt, the British Parliament levied a series of acts and taxes against the colonies in order to try and regain their lost financial footing. The colonists, who viewed themselves as loyal subjects to the British Crown, became increasingly agitated. It was not that the taxes were exorbitantly high. In fact, they were quite low, and often the measures taken by the British government were taken to lower the cost of British goods and raise the costs of those being sold by their French or Dutch competitors. For the colonists, the heart of the issue was not the cost, but rather the lack of consultation before levying the acts and taxes. As British subjects, the colonists believed they had all of the rights and liberties of any British citizen, which included representation. The British government argued that the colonists were represented virtually, and that the Parliament acted in their best interests. Many Americans did not agree, and resentment began to grow. The rallying cry became, "No taxation without representation," as more and more colonists began to view King George III as a tyrant and the British Parliament as an aggressor toward them.